Welcome to Hot Topics in International Trade, brought to you by Braumiller Law Group and Braumiller Consulting Group. Hi, this is Bob Brewer with Braumiller Law Group. A couple quick house cleaning notes. Up and coming, I'm talking now 2023, we've already got a couple of webinars in place I wanted to inform you of, one of which is going to be January 10th, and that is going to be on countervailing duty, anti-dumping, headed by Paul Fedax, our partner in Ohio. Going to lead that. It's going to be more of an interactive discussion. It's going to be with ICPA. We are global partners with ICPA. Also in February 7th, that is where we're going to do the IMEX 2 with Brenda Cordova, our partner, legal counsel down in Mexico. So what I'd like to do also is let you know at this time we're going to be talking with Adrienne Braumiller, partner and founder, Mama Bear, about forced labor. So, but all of a sudden now, this thing has come to the forefront. And why is that?
Yeah, so it's essentially due to a loophole that was in the law. And so the forced labor prohibitions have been in place since the 1930s.
Right.
But people could still bring articles into the U.S., even though they were made with forced labor, as long as they could meet what's called a consumptive demand exception. And so that essentially meant that the U.S. producers were not producing enough quantities to satisfy the demand in the U.S. So what happened with the Trade Enforcement and Trade Facilitation Act of 2015 is they repealed that exception.
Okay.
So no more can any party argue, but wait a minute, the U.S. doesn't have enough to meet demand.
Right.
That won't work.
Right.
Yeah, so that's why.
That was in 1930, you say? You know?
Way back to the 30s, yeah.
30s. Mm-hmm. Well, it was repealed by the Trade Facilitation.
And it was repealed in 2015.
That's a long time for that to be repealed. But,
yes.
So I guess the question is then what is it?
What is forced labor?
Yeah, I mean, what is it exactly?
It's two things, and I always tell people, remember, two specific requirements. One is it's involuntarily offered. In other words, it's not offered voluntarily. We'll put it that way.
All right.
So it's someone who's forced to work. It's against their will. And the non-performance of which, this is the second factor, there's a penalty, right? So they're laboring under the threat of a penalty. If you don't work for me, this is what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And there's so many different things that can make labor considered to be forced labor. If you retain identity documents, right?
Yeah.
So like if the factory manager says, oh yeah, everyone, hey, let me take care of your identity documents, your passports, whatever. Let me hold on to those for you for safekeeping.
Yeah, right.
That right there is considered forced labor. So you've got, identity documents being withheld. You've got isolation, where people are isolated from one another and their families. There's deception. There's physical violence. There's sexual violence. I mean, there's so many different indicators.
Right.
But all of it has to be where the party is not working voluntarily.
Gotcha. So officially then, this is the CBP implements this Section 307 is what it is. Mm-hmm. The Tariff Act of this 1930 we said through issuance of two things, withhold release orders and findings.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the difference between the two of those.
Okay. So those two deal with forced labor generally, right? So anywhere in the world that we have forced labor, you can end up receiving as an importer a withhold release order or a finding. The difference between the two is withhold release orders are issued by CBP when they have a reasonable suspicion that forced labor was used to manufacture the product. Whereas with a finding, it's basically a higher level of information. It's almost a conclusive finding.
Probable cause, they say.
Yeah, so probable cause is required. So it's a higher level than reasonable suspicion. And so the difference between the two is that you have more flexibility if you're on the receiving end of a WRO than you do if you receive a finding. With a WRO, generally the goods will be detained, and you'll have the ability to decide within 90 days whether you want to export or fight the WRO by proving that there was no forced labor.
Okay.
So you have 90 days to do that. Whereas with a finding, it's not automatic that you'll have this opportunity to export. So with a finding, essentially, the ability to export has been taken away, and so you're only left with being able to prove there was no forced labor. So findings are definitely more punitive than our withhold release orders, but mainly I think a lot of importers would prefer, because it's so difficult to put the evidence together that would convince customs there was no forced labor, to be able to export. So once you hit the findings level, you're kind of in a tough spot.
Okay.
But I wanted to differentiate the withhold release orders and the findings from the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, right? Because those are two different things.
That's right.
So the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is really the focus of this new act that came into play on June 21st. So the difference with that is that it's focused on that region in China where there are a lot of different minorities that are living, but are also being forced into different factories and other types of
Well, they're just
programs.
being distributed around mainland China.
Yeah, that too. So that makes it more difficult. But part of what the Department of Homeland Security is trying to do is that they have identified several entities. So it's not only that region, but it's also entities. And so any importer who is trying to do due diligence will look at the entity list and make sure they're not purchasing any goods, or that their suppliers are not purchasing any goods from those entities, because that, again, there's a rebuttable presumption that forced labor was used in the supply chain, and so it's hard to overcome that presumption. The only way you can do it is if you present clear and convincing evidence to customs that no forced labor was used, and it requires a lot.
Well, that's where Coca-Cola and Nike and Adidas and a bunch of about 85 different companies were lobbying, saying, we're going to do an audit, but this has got to be reasonable.
Yeah.
I mean, even look at subcontracting. I mean, Coca-Cola was all the way down to the sugar,
Yes.
that they were saying was being used, well, forced labor was being used, to prove that it is not in fact being used. Now, how do you prove that there's no Uyghur in your supply chain?
Yeah, I don't really know how you do that, honestly.
Well,
I mean, we have several things that we can talk about, but...
Well, one thing I want to mention is you'd think that, all right, now we're mentioning the Uyghur region in mainland China, you'd think that this discussion would be primarily about China and forced labor. This is worldwide.
Yes, it
All right.
is.
So, but of the, I think last time I checked, there were somewhere around 54 cases that were pending, split up between WROs and findings. The problem here was that of those 54, 35 were China.
Right.
Split up between WROs and findings, about 6 findings. But so that makes it about China.
Right. And essentially, a lot of the WROs have been superseded by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So they're still active. It's interesting. They're still active. And I think that the information there is helpful because they are focused on specific industries in those regions.
Right. So this is the important part of this, though, the aspect of give me your thoughts on how an importer could possibly make this work with customs. Because as well as I do, back up when you did that presentation with George Tuttle up in Chicago, I was sitting there and I thought, man, exercise in futility. When you started listing all of the things that there's just no way, I thought.
Well, I think the problem is that if you look at an importer's statutory obligation to use reasonable care, it includes making sure that you're not purchasing any goods made and importing them that are made with forced labor. So you have a reasonable care obligation anyway to make sure the supply chain is free of forced labor. So yes, it may seem like an exercise in futility, but it's legally required that importers make sure that they know who they're dealing with. So there's a lot of things that they can do. The first is, of course, vet existing suppliers, right?
Oh, okay.
Vet them, and that makes it difficult.
Now, I want to be honest with you peeps out there. Adrienne kind of disagreed with me. When I got done here in the presentation, I thought, here's what I want to do. I want to contact a company in China that does nothing but these audits, these investigations. I found out that, yes, they do, but only to a certain extent because it's under their social compliance program. Now, we went back and forth with a couple companies. The first two dropped out pretty quickly when I sent them the list.
Right.
The third one, and again, I do another shout out I have before with Harold Jackson in here with me to Lulu out there, it dissipated after we really got rolled out your PowerPoint that was really specific to her. And she said no, because the government would not permit us to knock on that door. Yeah.
Right. So there's 3 laws in China that are trying to block these laws. So technically, unless a company is going in doing a social compliance audit, which is a much higher level, audit, and it would touch on some things, but it probably wouldn't touch on everything that Customs wants.
Right.
But it might provide some assurances to Customs. So if you're able to take any video, that's great. But the problem is a lot of times, I'll say this. I was talking to someone the other day who said, oh, yeah, we have factories in China, and this particular client was saying, yeah, of course, we ask them, is there any forced labor? And they always say, of course not. There's nothing. We have nothing here.
There are no Uyghurs in our camp.
But I mean, how do you?
Well, that's my point.
Prove, yeah.
There is software out there that I was reading the other day that can be, that can handle in like 30 minutes an entire factory's database of employees. Just make it up.
Wow.
Yes.
Make it up?
Yes. You don't even know that it's legit.
Whoa.
Because think about it. If they tell you that this is not just an unannounced visit, it's a visit. Anybody steps out of line tomorrow, look out.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get somebody to say, oh my God, they're beating me. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, you're not. So that's
how you get a legitimate audit in the first place,
Well, and I think the one thing, when we talk about vetting suppliers, we have to think about prior to COVID, a lot of sourcing and quality people did travel to China.
Yeah.
So what I tell people is, let's leverage your prior knowledge with maybe trying to figure out some kind of certification or other questionnaire, other type of due diligence you can do to assure yourself that you feel comfortable about that supplier.
Right.
But so I think part of it is like, have you been there before? Have you seen the working conditions? If you have and you feel confident that there's nothing amiss, then I think that's also helpful. But it's only the beginning, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're over all the things that we're talking about, and there's so many different areas. Even Mexico has 2 where WROs in place.
Yes.
But right now, there's 0 penalties that have been issued.
There was one in 2020. I'm trying to remember the case. Yeah, there was one in 2020, and it was about 575,000, if I remember correctly. It wasn't very much, though, Bob. So this is a really good point. So yes, there are abilities. There's also criminal penalties that can be issued. Okay. Then there's 2 different statutes at play for civil penalties. But as far as the False Claim Act statute 1592,
right,
we haven't seen any penalties under that, and that's really what I think a lot of us would have expected because of the fact that Customs included forced labor in the reasonable care obligation.
Right.
So, but we haven't seen it yet.
Right.
One thing I thought was very interesting was last week I was participating in a panel with the director of policy. I forget his exact title over at the Department of Homeland Security, and he was on the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. I think he had one of the key people heading it up. So in talking to this particular official, he mentioned the fact that they have been very careful about having a slew of UFLPA, that's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, a slew of UFLPA detentions. He said, if you look at what we've done since UFLPA became effective on June 21st, you won't find this whirlwind or hurricane avalanche of detention cases under UFLPA because we're going in very cautiously and slowly. So I think that approach helps explain why there aren't so many penalties yet.
Okay.
I think they're even though they said there was no informed compliance period, for people from the date it became effective. Hey, it's legally binding. I still think it feels like they're giving a little bit more leeway to become more familiar. And I think Customs understands, even though everyone was supposed to have their ducks in a row by the 21st, they understand a lot of people are still trying to figure out how to do this.
And we're helping a lot of clients right now
Right.
to try to navigate this. And I personally expect things to loosen up a little bit.
Yeah.
Because right now, like I keep saying, an exercise in futility, some
I
things
don't
have
know
got
if
to
it'll
change.
loosen up. I don't think it will,
No?
Bob, because there have been so many Congress folks and senators who have said that they're very concerned about making sure Customs enforces UFLPA
Okay.
to the greatest extent possible. And I think we can all agree. Everyone can agree that forced labor should be eradicated. We all agree.
Everybody,
It's wrong.
even the 85 companies lobbying in Washington agreed on that.
It's wrong.
But we've got to go about this in a way that allows us
Yeah.
to conduct business with pushing forced labor out. Because they
Right.
recognized at the time that it was there to a certain extent.
Right.
This dates back to when it was really full force, to 2019,
Yeah.
2020, at the time.
And I think part of it is that Customs won't tell you, hey, we're asking you to leave China, but there are several companies that have left China because it's very difficult to have to trace your entire supply chain, your supplier.
Oh, yeah.
So there is no de minimis exception. You can't have 1% forced labor
Right.
in the product and say that's de minimis. If there's any forced labor, it's considered inadmissible.
Right.
So it cannot be admitted into the commerce. So there, in addition to vetting, which is really the hardest, right?
It is. I agree with that.
The vetting and the documenting of the entire supply chain. Customs is also saying that companies should have a code of conduct and that they should engage their stakeholders, meaning their suppliers, and
Right.
they should train them.
Right.
And they should actually hold those suppliers accountable to that code of conduct.
If we audit and we find that there is forced labor,
Yeah.
we're done with you.
Right.
That's what a lot of the bigger
Well,
companies have said.
what's really interesting is I think that is the right approach. I think Customs would say, hey, remediate those violations.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
mean cutting them off, but you can remediate them. In most cases, I would want to say goodbye because how could I trust that supplier, right?
Well, Adrienne, we're just about out of time, as I like to keep these down around 15 minutes. Do you have anything else you want to throw in here at the last minute?
I think the bottom line is that it's not a futility.
Exercise in futility.
Yeah,
no?
it's not an exercise in futility to try and understand your supply chain better and the parties who make it up. So I think that I think the importance of knowing who you're dealing with is critical to navigating well in this environment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, hey, I appreciate you stopping in, Mama Bear.
Okay.
Happy holidays to you. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Relax. We've got you covered. Global trade compliance to us is just another day at the beach.